My daughter was about 18 months old when the thought arrived. Not dramatically, in the ordinary way that significant thoughts sometimes arrive, between one moment and the next. She was on the floor of the living room, completely absorbed in something, the specific total concentration of a toddler engaging with the world. I was watching her from across the room, in the particular way you watch a child when you are not doing anything else. Just watching. And I thought about my father, not with anger, not with the specific hardness that had organized my feelings about him for years. Just thought about him as a person who had once watched me the way I was watching her, who had sat in a room and looked at a small version of me with whatever he had felt in those moments, before everything that came later, before the decision that had ended what we were to each other, before the years of silence. I sat with that thought for a long time. It was not forgiveness. It was not the resolution of anything that had happened. It was just a question about who he was, beyond what he had done, and whether the silence I had maintained for years was still the right answer to that question. But to understand why that question mattered, you need to know what the silence had been built on. My parents had been married for 26 years when my father left. Not a short marriage. Not one that had been visibly failing for years in a way that would have prepared anyone for the ending. Or so I had believed. Looking back now, with the perspective that time and my own experience of marriage has provided, I can see things I couldn't see at 24. Tensions that were present, but that I had been too young and too embedded in my own life to read accurately. The particular distance that can develop between two people who are functioning correctly on the surface while something underneath has been quietly shifting for years. I don't offer that as a defense of what my father did. It is not a defense. It is just the honest acknowledgement that the picture I had at 24 was not the complete picture, and that understanding a situation more fully does not require you to accept it. My mother was extraordinary throughout my childhood. The specific quality of a person who makes a difficult thing look easy, who manages the full weight of a family and a working life and a marriage with the particular competence of someone who has simply decided that things will be managed and proceeds accordingly. She was present in the way that counts, at the things that mattered, the school events and the illness recoveries and the difficult conversations. The ordinary, consistent presence that tells a child they are the priority. My father was present too. Different, less emotionally available in the specific way of men of his generation who understood their role primarily in practical terms. Providing, maintaining, being there in the physical sense without always being there in the way that children need. I had not resented that when I was young. I had understood it as simply how he was, as the particular texture of his presence, which was real, even if it was less warm than my mother's. He coached the football team I played on until I was 12, had opinions about my schoolwork. Turned up, the relationship was not what it might have been, but it was there. The affair had apparently been running for about 2 years before he left. I found that out after, in a specific, painful way that the timeline of these things reveals itself when the initial shock has settled enough to ask questions. He had met her through work, the particular proximity of people who spend significant time together, who find in each other something they have convinced themselves is missing elsewhere. He left on a Tuesday afternoon. My mother called me. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who is holding something together very carefully and is not entirely sure how long they can hold it. She told me what had happened, what he had told her, where he had gone. I drove to her house that evening, stayed for several days, did what you do when a parent needs the kind of support that only the presence of someone who loves them can provide. I spoke to my father once in that first period. A brief call. He tried to explain. I did not want to hear the explanation, not because I was incapable of understanding it, because in that moment the explanation was irrelevant to what my mother was experiencing. What I was experiencing, the damage of what he had done was real and present. The reasons for it could wait. They waited for years, eventually indefinitely, because the call that was going to allow the explanation to be heard never came, and the silence that had started as a response to immediate pain became something more permanent, something structural, a decision solidified by time into a fact about my life. My father existed somewhere. We did not speak. That was the fact. For 8 years. The silence was not difficult to maintain. That is the honest account of it. I had expected it to require more effort than it did. Had anticipated the particular pressure of family occasions where his absence would need to be managed, where questions would need to be answered, where the silence would be visible to people who knew us both. All of that was present, but the maintenance of the silence itself was not hard, because the anger that had produced it was sufficient fuel. For a long time, my mother rebuilt her life with the specific determination of someone who has been given no choice but to rebuild and has decided to do it properly. Not quickly, not easily, but genuinely. She found her footing over several years, found purpose in her work, invested in friendships that had thinned during the marriage, became more fully herself in the way that people sometimes do when the relationship that had partially obscured them is gone. I watched that recovery with genuine admiration, and with the particular bitterness that recovery from injustice sometimes produces, that she had been required to rebuild it all, that the life she had built across 26 years had been disrupted by a decision she had no part in making. The bitterness attached itself to my father and stayed there, not expressed constantly, present, in the background of how I thought about him, in the speed with which I closed conversations about him when they came up. In a specific way, I had reframed the memories of my childhood, revisiting them through the lens of what I now knew about him, looking for the signs I had missed, the evidence that the person I had known had been a version, had been performing something that wasn't entirely true. That reframing was its own kind of damage, because it took things that had been real and made them uncertain, memories that had been simply what they were, now carrying the shadow of question. Had he been present at those moments? Or had some part of him already been elsewhere? I got married 4 years after the divorce. My mother was there, a relative on my father's side who had stayed in contact, attended, and was warm and said nothing that required me to respond to his absence. My wife knew the history, had received it the way you receive the significant background of the person you have chosen, with the understanding that it was part of the person, not something separate. She never pushed me toward anything, never suggested I should reconsider the silence, never made it her project to reunite what I had decided to leave separated. She simply understood and was present for the life we were building in a way that made the gap where my father wasn't feel manageable. Not absent, manageable. Our daughter arrived 3 years into the marriage. The specific disruption of the best possible kind. The complete reconfiguration of what matters and what doesn't that a child produces in a person. The particular expansion of capacity for a specific kind of love that you had no idea existed before it arrived. I watched her grow in the ordinary daily way that parents watch children grow, through the stages of the first year and into the second. And somewhere in the watching, the thought arrived that I described at the beginning. Sitting on the floor of the living room, her absorbed in her own small world, me watching from across the room, thinking about my father, not with anger, with the specific curiosity of someone who has just understood something about their own position, that they are now the parent looking at the child, and that the parent looking at the child is a different vantage point from any they have occupied before. The shift in how I thought about my father did not happen all at once. It arrived in stages, over months, through the accumulation of small moments that each added something to a picture I was gradually building. Not a picture that changed what he had done, a picture that placed what he had done in a larger context, that contained more of him than the version I had been carrying. The first stage was the simple recognition of his humanity, which sounds obvious stated plainly, but which is not obvious when the person you're recognizing as human is the person whose actions have organized your grief and your anger for years. Watching my daughter grow produced in me a specific understanding of what it is to be responsible for a small person, to be the one they depend on, to feel the weight of that dependency daily, to understand that what you do and who you are will shape them in ways you cannot fully predict or control. That understanding made me think about my father as a parent, not as the person who had left, as the person who had once held me the way I held my daughter, who had been responsible for a small person who had depended on him, who had watched me grow with whatever he had felt during those years, before the decisions that had ended things. That version of him was not something I had allowed myself to think about, because thinking about it made him human. And human was harder to be angry at than the simplified version. The villain of a story is easier to maintain when you do not allow yourself to imagine them as a person with the full complexity that people have. I had been maintaining the simplified version for 8 years, and my daughter was slowly dismantling it, not intentionally, just by existing, by being the occasion that gave me the vantage point I had not had before. The second stage was a conversation with my wife, not a conversation she initiated, one that arrived naturally from something I had been carrying long enough that it needed to be said out loud. I told her what I had been thinking, about the vantage point, about the human version of my father, about the question that had been forming, whether the silence was still the right answer. She listened in the way she always listened, without directing, without her own agenda visible, just present. When I finished, she asked one question. She asked what I was afraid of. I thought about that for a long moment. The honest answer was complicated. I was afraid of what reaching out would mean for my mother, whether it would feel like a betrayal of what she had been through, whether the relationship I rebuilt with him would require a disloyalty to her that I was not willing to offer. I was afraid of what reaching out would do to the version of the story I had been living, which had a clarity to it, a clear line between the right side and the wrong side, a clear understanding of who had done damage and who had received it. Reaching out required living with complexity, with a version of events that had more than two sides. And I had been living with the simplified version for long enough that the complexity felt like a cost. And I was afraid of him, not in a physical sense, in the specific way you are afraid of the person who disappointed you most severely. Afraid of what another version of that disappointment would cost. Afraid of extending something and having it received badly, or not received at all, or received in a way that confirmed the version of him I had been protecting myself from having to revisit. My wife said she thought I already knew what I wanted to do, and that the fears were real, but were not a good enough reason to let the silence continue indefinitely. She said it gently, without pressure, as an observation rather than an instruction. I sat with it for several weeks more. Then I wrote a letter, not an email, a letter, the specific choice of a medium that carries a particular weight, that requires a different quality of attention than a digital message, that cannot be dashed off. That takes the time it takes. I wrote it over several days, draft after draft, each one trying to find the language that said what was true without performing anything, without the anger that some drafts contain too much of, without the false reconciliation that other drafts reach for too quickly. Just the honest middle. I'm reaching out. I've been thinking. I am not certain what I want this to become, but I'm certain the silence should not be permanent. I sent it and waited. He replied within a week. A letter, not an email. He had matched the medium, which told me something, that he had understood the weight of what I had sent, had recognized that it deserved a response in kind, not the quick digital reply that manages a situation, something that required the same quality of attention I had brought to the sending. I held the envelope for a moment before opening it. The particular experience of holding something that has arrived from a direction that has been closed for 8 years, something that carries a weight before you know what it contains. Because the weight is not in the content, it is in the fact of the arriving. I opened it. Read it once. Then again. He wrote simply, without the elaborate justification I had half expected. without the comprehensive account of why he had done what he had done and why it had been impossible to do otherwise, without the particular self-serving construction that people sometimes build when they are given the opportunity to explain a long-standing wrong. He said he had not expected to hear from me, that the letter had arrived on an ordinary morning and had not been ordinary, that he had read it several times before he had been able to think about how to respond. He said he was not going to try to explain everything in a letter, that if we were going to talk, then the talking deserved to happen in person, not in correspondence that could be drafted and redrafted until it said what the writer wanted it to say rather than what was true. He said he was glad I had written, said simply, without making it the centerpiece of the letter, just placed it clearly and moved on. He said he would come to whatever arrangement I was comfortable with, that the pace and the terms were mine to set, that he had no standing to ask for anything beyond what I was willing to offer, and that whatever I offered he would receive with the seriousness it deserved. I read that last part carefully, the acknowledgement of his own position, that the standing was mine, not claimed as shared, not presented as if 8 years of silence had produced an equal footing from which we were both stepping forward. He understood who had closed the door, and who was choosing to open it, and whose terms governed the opening. That understanding was important, more important than anything else in the letter, because it told me he had not spent 8 years constructing a version of events in which my silence was the wrong, in which he had been waiting patiently for a child to come to his senses, in which the reconciliation was something I owed him. He had not done that. He had sat with his own position, and the letter reflected the sitting. I showed the letter to my wife. She read it, said it was a good letter, said that didn't mean he was a different person, just that he had written a good letter. I agreed. A letter is not the person, but it is information about the person, and the information in this letter was better than I had prepared myself for. I told my mother. That was a conversation I had been dreading, not because I expected her to demand I choose, because I knew how much the name alone could cost her. She was quiet when I told her. The particular quiet I recognized from the call she had made to me 8 years earlier. Then she said something that surprised me. She said she had wondered when this would come, not whether. When? She said she had always known I would reach out eventually, that it was the kind of person I was, that she had made her own peace with the idea of it, not with what he had done, with the idea of me deciding to have a relationship with him. She said those were separate things. Her peace with what had happened, and her understanding that my choices about my own father were mine to make. She said she didn't need me to hate him on her behalf, that she had done enough of her own feeling about it, that she wasn't going to make my relationship with my father carry the weight of her history with her ex-husband. I thanked her. She said there was nothing to thank her for, that it was simply what was true. We met for the first time in 8 years on a Saturday morning. A cafe, neutral ground. Neither of us suggested anywhere that carried memory. He was older than I remembered. Of course he was. 8 years is 8 years. But the specific shock of seeing a familiar face that has moved through time without you watching it, that has been somewhere else all this time, acquiring the marks that time leaves, without you present for the accumulating. We shook hands, which was the right thing and also the strangest thing, and sat down. The first conversation lasted about 2 hours, not because we had 2 hours of things to say, because the pace of it was careful, neither of us moving faster than the moment allowed. The particular rhythm of two people who are both trying to be honest without being reckless, who understand that honesty deployed without care can do damage even when it is genuine. We started with the surface things, where he was living, what his life looked like, the ordinary catching up that provides the scaffolding for more significant conversation. He had aged well in most respects. The same quality of attention I remembered from childhood. The specific way he listened, which was present in the cafe the same way it had been present in the house I had grown up in. Some things persist, regardless of what surrounds them. He asked about my life, my work, my wife. He did not ask about my daughter immediately. I noticed that and respected it. He was not assuming access. not presuming that the conversation about the grandchild was available simply because we were in the room together. He was letting me lead, which was the letter being lived rather than just written. I told him about my life in the general terms of someone sharing information with a person they are still assessing, not withholding, not offering more than the situation had yet warranted. At some point, he asked if we were going to talk about what had happened. I said yes, that the surface conversation was necessary, but was not the point. He nodded, and we moved into it, not with drama, with the deliberate care of two people who understand that this specific conversation has been waiting for years and deserves to be done correctly. He did not offer the comprehensive explanation I had anticipated when I had thought about this moment. He said something simpler, that what he had done had been wrong, not explained by the circumstances, even if the circumstances were real, not justified by whatever had been absent in the marriage. Wrong. His choice. His failure. He said he had not handled leaving with the care that his family had deserved, that the specific way it had happened had added damage to damage, that he had told himself at the time that a clean break was cleaner, that prolonging it would cause more pain, that he had used that as a reason to be less present in the aftermath than he should have been. He said now he understood that what he had called a clean break was actually an avoidance of the difficulty of sitting with the consequences of what he had chosen, of facing the people he had hurt in the ongoing daily way that facing them would have required. He said he had been a coward in that specific way, and that the 8 years of silence had given him a long time to sit with what cowardice produces. I listened to all of it, not with the relief of someone who has been waiting for an apology, with the specific attention of someone who is assessing whether what they are hearing is true, not performed, not the version of remorse that has been constructed for the purpose of producing a response. He was not a man who performed easily. That had always been one of his qualities. The discomfort with performance, the preference for the direct statement over the managed impression. What he was saying carried that quality. It was not comfortable for him to say, and the discomfort of it was visible, which made it more credible. Not because suffering is evidence of truth, because genuine acknowledgement of wrong tends to cost something, and the cost was visible in him. I told him what the 8 years had been like, not the full account, the honest version of the central thing, that the silence had been easier to maintain than I had expected, that the anger had been sufficient fuel for a long time, that what had changed was not the anger resolving, but the arrival of a vantage point that made the simplified version of him feel insufficient. That my daughter had given me a way of looking at his position that I had not been able to access before. Not forgiveness, understanding, which was a different thing. He received that without minimizing it, without rushing toward the forgiveness that understanding was not. Just received it, and said that understanding was more than he had expected, more than he had perhaps earned, and that he was grateful for it. We sat with what had been said for a while. The particular quality of a conversation that has arrived somewhere real, that has produced something true, and that doesn't need to immediately move on to the next thing. Just needs to let what has happened settle. Before anything else, we met 3 more times over the following 6 months, each time a little less careful than the one before. Not less honest, less effortful. The specific quality of a relationship finding its level, settling into whatever it was going to be, which was not what it had been before. I want to be clear about that. The relationship we were building was not a restoration, not a return to something that had existed and been interrupted. What had existed before had been a father and child, the ordinary intimacy of people who share a life in the same house, who accumulate the kind of closeness that proximity produces. That was gone. 8 years and a specific kind of wrong had made it gone. What we were building was something different, a relationship between 2 adults who knew each other's history, who had chosen to be in contact, with the honest acknowledgement of what had happened between them, without pretending it hadn't. That kind of relationship has a different quality from the one that exists before its subjects have understood each other clearly. It is more deliberately constructed, more consciously maintained, less dependent on the assumption that goodwill is simply there, more aware of the specific effort required to make something work that does not work automatically. It was real, on the terms available to it, and the terms available to it were honest terms, which was worth more than a warmer relationship built on a less honest foundation. My wife met him on the third occasion. She had been patient throughout the process, had not pushed, had simply been available for the conversations that the process required, had listened consistently, and had trusted me to move at the pace that felt right. She met him with the specific openness of someone who has made a decision about how to show up for something. Not with warmth she didn't feel, with genuine willingness to see who he was, in the present tense, independent of the history. They talked for a while. He was attentive with her, asked questions that reflected genuine interest. The quality of attention that I had identified as genuine even as a child was directed at her with the same consistency. She told me afterward that she had found him difficult to dislike, that she understood why I had loved him as a child, and why what he had done had cost what it had cost. Both things visible in the same person, across the same afternoon. That is the particular complexity of flawed people who are also real. You can see both things simultaneously. The capacity for genuine connection and the capacity for genuine failure. And neither cancels the other. He met his granddaughter on the fourth occasion. I had told him she existed from the first meeting, had not offered the meeting as something immediate, had let it develop, had waited until the relationship between us had enough foundation to carry the weight of that specific moment. He arrived at our house on a Sunday afternoon. The particular occasion we had chosen because Sunday afternoons are ordinary, and the ordinariness felt right. The right container for something significant. She was 2 years old by then, in the specific phase of a 2-year-old who approaches strangers with a particular combination of curiosity and caution, who needs a moment to assess. Before deciding, he sat on the floor. I noticed that. The specific instinct of someone who understood that a small child needs you at their level, who knew without being told. The way people who have been parents know certain things that don't need instruction. She looked at him from across the room. He looked back, without performing, without the exaggerated warmth that some adults deploy with children, which children find confusing. Just looked, calmly, waiting. She crossed the room eventually, in her own time, the way she crossed rooms to all strangers once she had made her assessment. Handed him the thing she was carrying. A small object, meaningless to anyone else, entirely significant to a 2-year-old. He received it with the appropriate seriousness, examined it, said something to her about it. She was satisfied and moved on to the next thing, the way 2-year-olds do. I watched that exchange from the other side of the room, my wife beside me, her hand finding mine at some point. I don't know when, just aware at some point that it was there. I thought about my mother, who had said the choices about my father were mine to make, who had made her own peace with the idea of this, and who deserved to have it noted internally that what she had given me in saying that was significant, more significant than it might have appeared in the moment. I thought about the letter, and the reply, and the cafe on a Saturday morning, and the careful conversations that had produced what was in this room. An afternoon that would not have existed without the decision to reach out, without the willingness to live with complexity, without the understanding that people are more than the worst things they have done, and that the worst things they have done are still real. Both of those things simultaneously, without resolution, without one canceling the other. My father is in my daughter's life now, not in the way he would have been if none of this had happened. Not the grandfather who has always been there, who exists in the continuous fabric of her memory from the beginning. He is the grandfather who arrived, who is present now, who is building something with her in the time available. That is what is possible, on the terms available. And I have learned enough by now to understand that what is possible on the terms available is the only thing worth measuring. Not what would have been possible under other circumstances. Not what should have been. What is? What he is to her is something that will develop in its own way, on its own terms. without my history between them, which is how it should be. She will know him as himself, not as a version of him filtered through my experience of him. That is a gift the timeline has given her. Arriving late, without the before, just the now. I have not fully forgiven my father. I want to say that clearly, not because forgiveness is impossible, because it is a specific thing, and what I have is not quite that. What I have is something more honest, a clear-eyed relationship with a flawed person, who is present, who is trying, who cannot undo what he did, and who is not pretending he can. That is what we have, and it is real, in a way that only honest things are real. Forgiveness is not always the destination. Sometimes understanding is enough. And understanding arrived at honestly is worth more than forgiveness performed for the sake of the cleaner ending. If this story resonated with you, the complexity of it, the decision to reach towards someone who hurt you without pretending they didn't, leave in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.